Okay, so this is inclusive pedagogy through a critical race theory lens. Again, I'm Breanne Crumpton. I'm information literacy librarian for Humanities at Appalachian State University.
And I am Michelle Mitchell. I am the instructional services librarian at SUNY Morrisville. Just one quick note, I am currently at another conference and I have to catch a train, so I may have to leave for all of the Q&A or just part of it. So, but if you have any questions for me at the end, my email will be there, but Breanne will be available for those as well.
Two things before we get started. The first, as you can see in our cameras, me and Michelle are both white, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied people. So we want to recognize our privilege as we get talking into inclusive pedagogy, but also a critical race theory. The other thing I'll mention is that we have a lot of slides. There's a lot of information we're trying to share with you today. And so we have a link to the slide deck. And I believe Michelle's going to put that in the chat as well. So feel free to follow along so you don't feel like you have to be taking notes. You can kind of just listen and digest to what we're saying here.
Excuse me, we'd like to start off with an Indigenous land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge that we're presenting right now on the respective ancestral territories of the Massapequas, the Cherokee, and the Catawba peoples and other Indigenous peoples. We also acknowledge their displacement, dispossession, and continuing presence. So we just wanted to start out our presentation with a little bit of an origin story. We originally co-authored a book chapter in the forthcoming book, Exploring Inclusive and Equitable Pedagogies, Creating Space for All Learners, because we both have shared interests in inclusive teaching, critical librarianship, and critical information literacy, as well as anti-racist pedagogies. So the book chapter that we wrote is primarily a reflective essay about applying the principles of inclusive teaching from Columbia University's guide that is more geared toward traditional teaching faculty. So we wrote an essay for one-shot instruction sessions. As mentioned earlier, it's being published later this year by ACRL. But we wanted to take the opportunity with this presentation to review those inclusive pedagogy practices that we talked about in our chapter, as well as expand on our work through a critical race theory lens. And I won't read through all of the principles, but you can see on the right-hand column on the screen, these are the principles of inclusive teaching that Columbia University suggests in their guide. And we'll be using that to guide our presentation a little bit today too.
So our learning objectives for this session are as participants will learn inclusive pedagogy practices to incorporate to the one-shot information literacy session. And then participants will be introduced to tenets of critical race theory and use these tenets as an anti-racist lens in which to view the pedagogical practices that we're going to talk about. So the basic session outline, we're going to do a little collaborative discussion here in a moment, and then Michelle's going to walk through an introduction to inclusive pedagogy and some of the concepts and classroom practices that you can incorporate into your one-shots. I'm going to give a brief introduction to critical race theory. As was mentioned earlier, if you want a really thorough look at critical race theory, I would definitely recommend checking out Olivia Rossetti's presentation that happened in the previous session. And then we're going to take the tenets that we talk about in critical race theory and then apply them to the inclusive pedagogy practices. So it's a lot if you're looking at the slides, but we really wanted to make sure that we are giving people things that they can walk away with. So it is going to be a little bit of information overload, but I hope you will have the slides to revisit at a later point. And then we'll just wrap up the questions.
So we're going to get started with our collaborative discussion. So I'm going to place our Padlet link in the chat right now, but it's also available on the screen for you. But we're just wondering, what does inclusive pedagogy mean to you? If this is a brand new concept to you, totally fine. We're just interested in hearing what it may sound like, if you've used it before, how you've put it into practice, really just what does it mean to you? Oh, the Padlet is private. Okay, one moment while we troubleshoot, but if you want to, while we're doing that, you can start typing in the chat for now, and then move on, just to kind of take up some time.
Okay, if you want to retry the Padlet now, it should be working. All those hidden settings that we can miss sometimes.
Looks like it's popping up for me. Is it working for everyone else? Okay, great. So let's take about 3 minutes or so to plop in your answers. If you haven't used Padlet before, there should be a plus sign in the bottom right corner for you to add your thoughts.
Okay, I'm gonna say let's just forget the Padlet, let's drop it. But if people want to share in the chat what inclusive pedagogy means to you, we'll also invite you to just unmute if you want to give an answer as well.
Sorry for technical difficulties.
You'd think I know Padlet by now. I use it all the time, but clearly not.
Things happen. So, okay, great. So Emily just said designing teaching and learning experiences in a way that reaches the most students equitably and effectively. It's a great response. We'll wait for a couple more responses before we move on. Teaching students as people, yeah. So recognizing that students are more than just students, right? And that was said by Wendy. Roseanne is saying, considering the variety of experiences and language that students are familiar with. Jane, inclusive pedagogy is designing learning experiences that take into account all learners' abilities and prior experiences. Pamela says, not assuming where people are. Wow, lots coming in now. So centering students' individual experiences. Anders said, Annie also said, providing flexible options. Kelly said, I like to learn and use student names by using name tags. Find out where they're coming from prior to coming to the library. Wow, you guys are all experts. We're going to be talking about a lot of these practical approaches to inclusive pedagogy in the next few slides. And some of these we do talk about. So I'm sorry if I didn't read everybody's response, but these are all great. And we're going to move on now. Thank you so much for participating. Okay, so we're going to move into the introduction to inclusive pedagogy to just start out the frame of our presentation. So we wanted to really provide a succinct quote that describes what inclusive teaching is. And we found a great description or definition by Yale University at their Poorview Center for Teaching and Learning. And they said inclusive teaching refers to pedagogy that strives to serve the needs of all students, regardless of background or identity, and support their engagement with subject material. And I see that as being reflected in a lot of your responses as well. So really taking into account that you want to create an inclusive space, a welcoming environment, even if we only do that in a 75-minute time frame. Okay. So now we're moving toward some of the inclusive pedagogy practices. This will be identified by the main header on our slides, and then some like strategic practices that you can use. So these are the top headers are from the Columbia Guide, or adapted from them. And then the rest goes on from what we were talking about. So building instructor-student rapport. As I think Kelly mentioned, learning student names and making sure yours is visible. This is a fairly easy practice. I like to write my name on the board or make it visible on the PowerPoint, along with my contact information. And Kelly's idea of having name tags, if possible, is great, or even asking for students' names when they answer questions is a good way too. And then another suggestion we have for this is soliciting research topics from students and also being upfront about research struggles. We're not perfect at research just because we're librarians, and I think it's important for students to see that. Student to student rapport. So if possible, you should consider in-class group activities like Think, Pair, Share. If you've ever been to a conference before, I feel like this is a pretty common group activity. Some presentations or even panels may do with audience members. So this is something that you could strive to do in your class to get students talking with one another. And also create activities that encourage students to incorporate and share their past experience, research experiences or lived experiences with their classmates, and even you as the instructor, as long as they're comfortable. Bringing in prior knowledge and experiences, that was mentioned in a lot of our responses as well. So one way you could do this before having the instruction session is send out a survey to the teaching faculty to gauge students' prior knowledge in order to inform your instruction session. Other ways I do this is maybe having a Mentimeter question up front, just to see maybe 1 or 2 key skills students already know or remember, and then that can inform you how to move forward. Understanding your own identity. This is a big one. So you want to understand how the facets of your identity can impact perceptions, either that the students have of you or maybe the perceptions that you have of the students. So this is where reflection will be really key for your own teaching. And ask yourself, is there a power dynamic between you and the students? What assumptions might someone make about you? As Breanne mentioned at the start of the presentation, I have a lot of privilege with being a cisgender white woman. I'm very aware of my positionality, especially as an instructor. So you just want to take that into consideration when you're going into your classroom as well. And this leads right into positionality in classroom space, both as your identity, but then also as the space itself. So you want to consider the classroom space and its setup. Where are you going to be? How can you move about the room? A lot of this is an ableist assumption, as noted in our second point. So just know how you can set yourself up well, and maybe what would be a disadvantage for yourself or even the students. Model expected behaviors. This one can be a tricky one, as I feel like as a white woman in particular, I don't want to have white norms being the precedent. So that is also something to take into consideration. But essentially with this one, in inclusive pedagogy, you want to model the skills students are expected to demonstrate during an in-class activity. And I think we kind of do that just in our demonstrations with how to use certain tools. So really just how to get them to the success of completing an assignment or an activity. And again, reflection is really important. So reflect on your own behavior, intentional or not, recognize how it impacts the classroom environment, how students engage with you, or how they're not engaging with you, and see maybe why that's occurring. Provide multiple means of engagement. So I think it's really important to check for understanding throughout sessions. I know sometimes when I'm presenting, I can be a little nervous and forget to check with folks on, okay, are these concepts being comprehended well? Sometimes you can tell by body language, but of course you don't want to make assumptions about that. So just check and see where students are at throughout your sessions. Ask students about their current search strategies, either in a large group format or when you're talking with them one-on-one while they're doing activities. And also just consider how your students may want to engage with your content, may be different on every campus or even in every sort of class. Address challenging moments head on. It's really important to name microaggressions. You need to stop, name what happened, talk about it. You don't want to just cast over it. It's really important to really name it in your space, and also then give students space to reflect and recoup from probably an intense moment. Select diverse content. This may be a little bit trickier in one-shot sessions, but ways that you can do this is advocating that published peer-reviewed articles are truly not the only reliable sources of information. This will take some faculty collaboration and discussion as well, but it's really important that degrees are not the only way that somebody can have authority on a topic or have expert knowledge on something. So I think bringing that into instruction sessions is one way to do this. And then also ask students to critically consider whose voices are being considered or even left out and why that's occurring. Provide multiple means of representation. Reflect on your lesson. So again, reflection, very important here. It may only favor one learning modality. Are you only providing things digitally, or maybe are you only providing activities physically and not in both modalities? Are they accessible in nature? Which leads into the second one, just make sure they're accessible for persons with disabilities. I think it's helpful to repeat concepts if it's something new to the students and clearly outline the information that you're going over. So one way to do that is having the learning outcomes or the goals for the day on your presentation, on a board, on your activity. And then also collaborate and meet with your institution's accessibility office and or instructional designer if you have one. They're really extremely helpful on accessibility practices and how to make your content more streamlined for everyone. Set clear expectations. So I kind of jumped ahead with this first one, but yeah, outlining session outcomes so students know what they're accomplishing that day. It's helpful to know what goal they're working toward and why they're in your session. And then asking teaching faculty for the assignment rubric in order to reiterate any research requirements. I think the rubric can be helpful if they're looking for really specific resources, or maybe they have something unique that you don't typically teach. It may be helpful for you to know the requirements and how students will get there so that you can explain that to students as well. And then if available, discuss with faculty if their rubric is realistic or not. I know that takes a lot of good rapport with your teaching faculty, but sometimes requirements for sources or other research components just aren't realistic for students. And also it can be really challenging if they're requiring something that's not attainable. Provide exemplary work. Again, this one's a little bit more challenging for one-shot sessions, but you can show students examples of outcomes you're looking for. So possibly creating a supplementary LibGuide on a course LibGuide, and that's helpful for showcasing like maybe completed activities that you've done, just so that they have a visual cue of what you might be looking for. Convey same level of confidence across students. So this one's really important and leads into a couple of others of not making assumptions about your students' abilities or prior knowledge. So you want to set high standards for all your students. Do not lower them to meet your assumptions. I think it's really important that we uplift our students and don't assume that they don't know anything, because more often than not, that's not the case. So you want to emphasize your own ability to help them succeed and support their abilities in doing these research projects. And also, if possible, I know this is a little challenging. We're currently working on this at SUNY Morrisville, but scaffolding information literacy skills throughout course levels so that you can build upon those skills when you have interactions with students in different course levels. And that can also help in avoiding assumptions and encouraging student success. Again, avoid making assumptions. This is a big one. We really just want to be mindful of existing stereotypes. Again, I think it's really common that we have assumptions about students' research abilities, and then how we perpetuate them and kind of maybe set back our sessions by really catering to those assumptions. And then also you can suggest research consultations for students if you feel like they need more help for that one-on-one contact. And that also gives them an opportunity to talk to you more about what they're looking for.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about critical race theory now. I told you all this was a bit of information overload for you, but what we wanted to do with that first section and what Michelle was doing was really going through what we discussed in our upcoming chapter and pulling out Columbia's principles on inclusive teaching and talking about how it can be applied for one shot. And these are common things we see throughout inclusive pedagogy discussions, other inclusive teaching guides. But I would say me and Michelle were at a different place than we were when we wrote it. And we've been learning, we've been expanding what we're looking at, and critical race theory is something that's come up. And so we wanted to then take critical race theory and re-examine what we put in our chapter through this lens. So I'm going to give a very brief, not really overview of critical race theory. And as I mentioned earlier, and I would just reiterate it again, there was a great conversation that really went in depth on critical race theory in the previous session. I encourage you to check that out. So this is a quote from the American Bar Association. CRT critiques how the social construct of race and institutionalized racism perpetrates a racial caste system that relegates people of color to the bottom tiers. So CLT also recognizes that race intersects with other identities, including sexuality, gender identity, and others. So critical race theory came out of legal studies that were looking at how the legal field treatment of laws and rules, and saying that colorblindness is the answer to racism really actually disadvantaged a lot of people, and it's centering, white as the norm. And so it is creating these caste structures within how people benefit and don't benefit from different systems. So I'm going to be drawing the critical race theory tenets that we are talking about today from Sofia, Leung and Jorge López-McKnight's Knowledge Justice. If this is a book that you are not familiar with, I definitely recommend checking it out. It is open access on MIT Press's website. And so I'm going to draw, again, the tenets that we talk about from their introduction, and they give a great introduction overview of critical race theory as well that would be good to read. So one of the tenets is race as a social construct. So this is saying race is socially constructed and not biological. It was the 19th century or so, there's that whole discourse that they were trying to say that different races are inferior because their skulls are smaller, and so their brains must be smaller. And The reality is that across races, humans are very similar biologically, and there's no really difference there. It was more of a social construct that would allow white to be superior over other races. And then racism is normal. Race is doing exactly what it is intended to do, which is to maintain a social structure rooted in white supremacy. So especially for those of us who might be white, I know when I grew up, I was taught racism is about individual action. So that individual is racist. So because I'm not that individual, I must not be racist or participating in racism because I'm not saying things that are clearly talking against a race. But this tenet of critical race theory, which is very important, is saying that racism has been normalized by our society. And racism isn't so much about individual actions, it's about the systemic underlying structure that is creating systems of oppression. And a lot for, I'll say, especially for white people, and I'll generalize here, but it's so normalized for us that we don't see it. We don't see where white's being centered. We don't see how systems are being racist. And because it has become that norm, it helps maintain that white supremacy structure that has been part of our country since the very beginning. Experiences and knowledge of BIPOC. So this is about centering experiences that have often been erased or forgotten or ignored of BIPOC people. As a white person, I cannot understand in full the experiences that my BIPOC colleagues are going through because they're not the same. And so I need to listen to what they're saying, and I need to trust that what they're saying is grounded and truthful in their experiences and knowledge. Intersectionality, so this was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. So being aware of overlapping oppression to better understand how power operates in a society. So it's not just race that has systems of oppression, it's gender identity, it's sexuality, it's disability, ableism, things of that nature that create these overlapping oppressions. And so you have to understand how these oppressions overlap to understand how power is kind of at play. And then interdisciplinarity or interdisciplinary, so the boundaries between disciplines are falsely constructed barriers. So if you think about if you're at a college or university, it's very much departmentalized in terms of Department of Art, Department of English, Department of History. And these are falsely constructed barriers. So what this tenet of critical race theory is really getting at is that we need to pull from different disciplines in terms of their approach to knowledge, their approach to information to really get to racial justice. We can't just take one pocket here and think it's going to solve everything. We have to be interdisciplinary in our approach. And then critiques of dominant ideologies. So this is challenging these stories of colorblindness, objectivity, neutrality, which is very present in our field. And also meritocracy as it comes to the individual over community that's very grounded in capitalism. And then just a few more, so focusing on historical context. So the idea here is that you must understand historical, social, and economic context to understand how we got to this point in history, to understand why people think the way they do and might be resistant to change, understanding really what has gone on to lead up to this point. And then counter storytelling and voice. So this kind of goes into, sharing those experiences and knowledge of BIPOC, but also using counter storytelling as a tool for exposing, analyzing, and challenging the stories of racial privilege. So that if someone comes and says, I don't have white privilege because I grew up poor, it's using counter stories of people's experiences to show that you still have a level of privilege, even if you don't have every level of privilege that might be available. And then finally, interest convergence. So this is the idea that marginalized interests are considered only when they converge with the interest of powerful whites. So in a library context, this might be, and I think the example of ALA was mentioned in the other session, but showing that you're having a diversity and inclusion committee to say, look, we're doing DEI work, but the work of that committee is not so much to actually make change, but to show that you are in the know of DEI work and that you're doing stuff that you're hoping to attract marginalized individuals, but you're really not actually doing anything to change that white normative culture of the library. And so what we wanted to do is take these tenets and go back through those practices that Michelle mentioned, and then see how critical race theory and those tenets can either critique a practice so that we can further it or provide support for a practice. And so you'll either see like a plus for support or a minus if it's kind of a critique of the practice.
So going back to the building instructor student rapport, so we have those of that we mentioned before, but something that's a critique that we didn't, or that instructional pedagogy did not touch on, is that, again, it doesn't specifically speak to racial hierarchy or positionality. That language is omitted from the instructor student rapport aspect.
Yeah, and I'll just add, it's one of those things, like if we don't name it, we can't really talk about it, but like with rapport especially, that's a social aspect, so you need to be aware of how race plays a role. And then with student to student rapport and thinking through, you know, trying to get students to further build the relationship that they're already forming in their classes. So critical race theory, I think, supports this student to student rapport aspect of inclusive pedagogy, especially with the critiques of dominant ideologies, thinking of that meritocracy, because critical race theory is really about collaborative community work that can be used to fight the meritocracy of capitalism, also systems of oppression, but not saying it's on an individual, saying it's building a community.
Bringing in prior knowledge and experiences. So what wasn't specifically mentioned through inclusive pedagogy is that it doesn't prioritize BIPOC voices that are often marginalized in our field, but just in academia in general, and also in traditional information systems. So like in databases and catalogs, their voices aren't prioritized or put up front. So this is a critique to some inclusive pedagogy practices.
And then with understanding your own identity, this is mentioned a lot in inclusive pedagogy and inclusive teaching practices. But a lot of times they don't name race, or it's not centered. It's just kind of a list of these are aspects of your identity to consider. But again, going back to the instructor-student rapport, racism is normal. So that tenet, we need to understand how whiteness is normalized in the classroom, in our teaching practices, and how we interact with students. So this is a critique of understanding your identity, to just say it needs to really center that race piece so that it can acknowledge the oppressive systems that these perceptions are grounded on, that might be changing how students see you, but also how you see students.
Positionality in classroom space. So a critique for this one is that typical academic classrooms, or the ways that we teach, are often reinforcing Eurocentric ways of learning. I think this is particularly pertinent for if any of us teach international students, and maybe what accommodations or just adjustments we need to make for their learning. And this just kind of perpetuates how we're teaching, and also just leaning on white norms again. So I think this is a huge critique for this practice.
And I'll also just add to this one, a lot of classroom spaces are set up in that lecture style. that kind of really hones back into lectures of, I mean, take it back to ancient Greece and Socrates, but understanding that the classroom itself might lend itself to this more Eurocentric. So if it's a classroom where you don't really have a lot of control over the setup of it, just being very mindful of that and thinking through how you can adapt to whatever you have to work with. And then model expected behaviors. So Michelle mentioned this earlier, but if the instructor is white, if you are a white person, you could be, if you're modeling expected behaviors in terms of how they're supposed to research, how they're supposed to behave in the classroom, it could be advocating for students to assimilate to the white norms that are very present in academia. So this is, again, that normative nature of whiteness that can be invisible if we're not looking for it and if we're not seeing it. So with that inclusive pedagogy practice, think through what expected behaviors it is that you're asking students to model, or you want to model to students, and ask yourself, is that grounded in the white culture of the institution?
Provide multiple means of engagement. So a criticism for this practice is that it's highly individual focused. So it's not connecting to that critical race theme of community work and engagement. And it's referring back to the meritocracy of capitalism. So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind, even when we do include individual work. I think it's important to make sure that students are able to have a collaborative and community feel in one way or the other, so that they know that their peers are with them and are able to support them too.
Addressing challenging moments head on. So again, that racism is normal is a big tenet of critical race theory that I would definitely familiarize yourself with if you're not. But this is where critical race theory, I say, would really support this notion, this part of inclusive pedagogy, that you need to name the microaggressions, because not naming these moments can perpetuate white supremacy and racist practice if unchecked. So if a student, thinking about the student who is the microaggression might be directed at, if you're not addressing that moment, if you're not helping them work through the emotional trauma that they might then be experiencing and bringing it to the larger class's attention, then you're not really in the corner, because you're letting something that could be potentially traumatic happen to them.
I think that can also happen not in classroom spaces too. If you're just walking about the library and you hear something, or even on campus, I think it's our duty to stand up and advocate for stopping those microaggressions. Selecting diverse content, we have a couple of points for this one. Something that is supportive through critical race theory for this inclusive practice is that we need to be mindful of whose voices are showing up in search results, and also the politics of citations. So I think it's really important to point this out to our students and make them aware that this is something to consider and to really think about when they're doing research and who they're including in their papers. Something that is a critique of this practice through critical race theory is that it doesn't specifically mention engaging in content outside of the disciplines, so that interdisciplinary nature. I think that's really important, that when we're looking at maybe a certain subject, we encourage students to look outside of that subject in order to get a well-rounded view of what others are saying about that topic.
And then to continue, so diverse content, when inclusive pedagogy is telling you to select it, it doesn't talk about the politics of citation. That is really important. It's usually framed around, it's important to have voices that represent the students in the classroom. But the whole politics of citation and how voices can be erased through the academic systems, they don't show up in our databases, they don't end up in journals. because of that kind of historical white context of academia. So when you're selecting diverse content, make sure that you're mindful of the politics of citation that is at play, that uplifts usually white voices in citations and downplays other BIPOC scholars' contributions. We did note that that advocating against just the peer-reviewed articles does help with counter storytelling and voice. So we have that golden standard of academia as that peer-reviewed article, but we need to acknowledge engaging a diversity of resources. So again, the politics of citation means that a lot of BIPOC scholars, their work gets downplayed, overlooked. So they might end up publishing in other spaces, blogs, Twitter, and it's important for us to utilize those and counter storytelling of what shows up in peer-reviewed articles only.
Provide multiple means of representation. Two things that uplift this inclusive pedagogy practice is that that we're being aware of many, or this practice is being aware of many disabilities that are invisible. So even if we can't see it, it's important that we just provide those means of representation for our students. And then also another supportive point through critical race theory is building a coalition around promoting accessibility as a norm. So receiving training and then just including these practices into our sessions just right from the bat.
So we'll try to get to the next few quickly, just in time in consideration of the time. So setting clear expectations. This is again focusing on a historical context. So considering the expectations of faculty assignment can help us advocate for any areas that might be problematic, that might just be part of what's coming up through history, the context of academia, and thinking through again that white normative nature. But it's also allowing us to contextualize what we're talking about in the classroom so that we can kind of utilize some of that historical context of what they've already learned in the class to where they're going.
Provide exemplary work. Something that is a critique to this inclusive practice is that it does not state to provide examples to specifically uplift BIPOC voices. So this is something that this practice really needs to work on.
Having the same level of confidence across students, it's promoting that idea of neutrality and meritocracy again, because you're treating all students as kind of a monolith when you're putting them at the same level. So this could be a problematic fault with this practice. And really what you want would be to see where students are at and understand the identity and how that impacts where they're coming from, and then build accordingly to that, maybe in a scaffolded way.
Avoid making assumptions. A critique of this is being mindful of racial stereotypes that society has created based on certain race categories. Those are social constructs. We really need to be mindful of those, that they're not informing how we approach our classrooms, especially after we see who's attending our classes.
And then interest convergence was the last tenet of critical race theory, and we didn't have a specific practice to link it to, but we would like to ask you all just to consider where your interest is at, especially if you're a white librarian in inclusive teaching and critical race theory. Are you doing it because it's trending right now in a lot of our conversations and talking? Or are you actively interested in dismantling systems of oppression? And if that is the case, how are you working to dismantle those systems outside of the classroom and teaching, in addition to bringing those concepts into the class? So food for thought there. But in conclusion, I think it's safe to say me and Michelle would have approached our chapter a lot differently if we had engaged with critical race theory beforehand. But some of our concluding thoughts: inclusive pedagogy practices often take a neutral stance because they don't actively name racism or engage in systemic racism that's happening in our society. Inclusive pedagogy does not engage in critically examining those systems of oppression and racism that underlie academia and by default underline our work because we are situated within these institutions of academia. And then critical race theory can be a way to expand on our pedagogical practices to fully understand how to equitably address students' identities and uplift marginalized voices. So in our presentation, we're not saying inclusive pedagogy and inclusive teaching is not a way to go in terms of your teaching, but what we're really advocating for is using critical race theory to further think about those practices and what you're bringing into your classroom. So this is references and further readings, and we will move on to the question